Your kindness is appreciated, Mrs. Fairfield. Not love, not tenderness, not even her name spoken like it meant something. On their wedding, James Fairfield looked at the woman he had just married and offered her a business compliment. He had bought her to save his crumbling estate, and she gave him 2 years of her life, her intelligence, her hands, and her heart. She rebuilt everything he had lost. She earned the loyalty of every soul on that land. And the day she finally stopped waiting for him to choose her was the day James Fairfield understood what ruin actually felt like. If this story already lives somewhere inside you, subscribe to our channel and tell us what city are you watching from tonight. The wedding contract was signed before James Fairfield ever learned his wife's favorite flower. He did not ask. It did not occur to him that the question mattered. In the spring of 1816, James stood at the altar of St. Clement's Chapel in a charcoal mourning coat pressed 3 times that morning by a valet who had not been paid in 11 weeks. The guests murmured behind their gloves. The candles burned low. And James Fairfield, 4th son of the late Earl of Westhaven, kept his hands perfectly still at his sides and his expression composed, because that was what a gentleman did when he was quietly drowning. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man completing a transaction, because that was exactly what he was doing. Fairfield Manor had been the jewel of the Westhaven line for 3 generations, 400 acres of Virginia countryside, a limestone manor house with 16-room stables that once held the finest thoroughbreds in the county. The Fairfield name commanded respect in every drawing room from Richmond to Philadelphia. Old money, old blood, old pride. The problem was that old money had a way of running out. James's father had been generous to a fault loans to neighbors who never repaid them. Investments that failed before the ink dried a renovation of the East Wing that cost twice the budget. When the elder Fairfield died, James inherited not only the estate, but every debt attached to it. $64,000. The solicitor read the number aloud on a Tuesday morning in February, 2 years before the wedding. James sat very still through the full list of creditors. When it was finished, he said only, "Leave the documents on the desk." He did not move for a long time after the man left. He sat in his father's chair, now, and looked at the oil portrait above the fireplace. The late Earl stared back at him with that same composed expression James had inherited, and James understood not for the first time that composure was a devastating thing to inherit, when what a man actually needed was a solution. The solution arrived in the form of Richard Pembroke. Richard Pembroke was not old money. He was not old anything. He had built a trading fortune from a single dry goods store in Charleston, expanding through sheer determination into a network of businesses that stretched from the Carolina coast to the Ohio Valley. He was loud where the Fairfields were quiet. He laughed with his whole chest at dinners where Fairfield men only smiled. But Richard Pembroke had one vulnerability. He wanted a name. Not for himself. He was practical enough to know that was not possible. For his daughter. For his blood. He wanted Mary to carry a name that opened doors no amount of money could pry open on its own. James Fairfield needed money. Richard Pembroke needed a name. The negotiation took 3 meetings and 1 expensive dinner. Mary was not present at any of them. She learned about the arrangement on a Thursday afternoon when her father called her into his study and told her with the particular gentleness of a man who has already decided something and is only now informing the person most affected by it that she was to be married to James Fairfield of Westhaven County before the end of spring. Mary sat across from his desk and said nothing for a moment. "And Mr. Fairfield," she began carefully, "has he expressed any particular—" "He has agreed." Richard's voice was final. "The arrangement is settled. You will have a beautiful home, a respected name, everything a woman of your position could want." "Everything," Mary said quietly, "except a husband who chose me." Her father's expression shifted, not with guilt exactly, but with the discomfort of a man who knows he is right about the practical matters and wrong about everything else. "Mary, I understand, Papa." Her voice did not waver. "I will be ready." She said nothing more. But that night alone at her writing desk, she made herself a private promise. If she was to enter a marriage built on commerce, she would conduct herself with the same discipline she had watched her father apply to every business he had ever built. She would not waste her life mourning what the marriage lacked. She would invest herself in what it could become. She did not yet know how difficult James Fairfield would make that promise to keep. The wedding was everything a proper 1816 Virginia ceremony was supposed to be. The guests wore their finest. The chapel smelled of beeswax and fresh flowers, lilacs, as it happened, which were Mary's favorite, though no one had known that when they arranged them. The coincidence struck her when she walked down the aisle, and she decided privately to take it as a sign. James stood at the altar and watched her approach. How was handsome, tall, and lean, with dark eyes, and the kind of jaw that portrait painters appreciated. He held himself with the effortless authority of a man who had been taught since childhood that rooms arranged themselves around him. He watched her come toward him, and his expression was correct. Appropriate. Neither cold nor warm. When she reached him, he took her hand. "Miss Pembroke." His voice was low, formal. "You look very well." "Thank you, Mr. Fairfield." That was the entirety of the tenderness between them before they spoke their vows. At the end of the evening, when the last guests had gone, James found Mary standing at the window of the front parlor. He came to stand beside her. "I want you to know," he said, his voice losing some of its formal edge, not warm but honest, "that I intend to treat you with every respect this position deserves. You will want for nothing material. The staff will answer to you in household matters, and I will be fair." Mary turned from the window and looked at him. "Fair," she repeated. "Yes. That is a business term, Mr. Fairfield." Something moved behind his eyes. "Perhaps it is. Then let me offer you one in return." Her voice was steady, quiet. "I intend to be an asset to this estate, not merely a name on a contract. I hope you will allow me to demonstrate that." He studied her for a moment, as if he was recalibrating something. "Of course," James said. He meant it as politeness. He had no idea yet how completely she would make him mean it. The trouble with Fairfield Manor became apparent to Mary within her first week. Not the financial trouble, she already knew about that. Her father had been thorough, and Mary had read every document he placed before her, because Mary Pembroke had been reading her father's business documents since she was 14 years old. What she had not anticipated was how thoroughly James had stopped paying attention to his own estate. It was not laziness. It was something closer to despair dressed up as detachment. A man who had inherited a crisis so large that he had unconsciously begun retreating from the details of it. He moved through Fairfield Manor the way a man moves through a house that is no longer quite his. Mary touched everything. She started in the kitchens. The cook, Agnes Stout, formidable 20 years with the household, received her with the wariness of a woman who has survived many changes in management by making herself indispensable. Agnes. Mary set her notebook on the kitchen table. "I would like you to walk me through the household accounts, every line, starting from January." Agnes blinked. "Ma'am, I'm not looking for errors or fault." Mary pulled out the chair at the head of the table, Agnes's chair by habit, when the lady of the house was absent, and sat in it without ceremony. "Please, sit with me." Something shifted in Agnes's face. She sat. By the end of that morning, Mary had identified 3 places where supply costs could be reduced without affecting meal quality. 2 vendor relationships, costing the house above market rate, and 1 significant ledger irregularity from the previous October that Agnes had flagged twice to the former steward and been ignored both times. "You brought this to Mr. Hargrove." Mary looked at the entry carefully. "Twice." Agnes's voice was dry. "He told me to leave the accounts to the men who understand accounts." Mary looked up. "I understand accounts." Agnes said nothing for a moment. Then, "Yes, ma'am, I'm beginning to see that." It was not friendship, not yet, but it was something. The steward Hargrove was a problem of a different kind. He brought the estate ledgers to her with the particular reluctance of a man surrendering personal territory, standing at the side of the desk while she read with the hovering posture of someone waiting for her to give up and ask for help. She did not ask for help. She read every page. When she finished, she looked up. "Mr. Hargrove, The tenant accounts for the south field. I see 3 families listed as current on their payments, but the corresponding entries in the receipt ledger don't reflect those payments. Walk me through how you've been recording those transactions." Hargrove's face went through several colors quickly. "Mrs. Fairfield, there are conventions in estate accounting that—" "I understand estate accounting, Mr. Hargrove." Her voice was pleasant, immovable. "Walk me through the convention you've been using, please." He could not, because there was no convention. There was only the fact that Hargrove had been quietly stealing from the tenant receipts for 18 months, counting on the chaos of the estate's financial crisis to provide cover and James's detachment to protect him. He had not counted on Mary. That same afternoon, she laid the full picture before James in the study. Relevant ledger pages, open discrepancies annotated in her precise handwriting. She presented it without drama, without accusation. She showed him the numbers and let the numbers speak. James stood very still while she walked him through it. When she finished, he looked at her. "How long did it take you to find this?" "3 days of reading." A silence. "Hargrove has been with the estate 4 years." "Yes. And no one—" He stopped. "No one was looking closely enough," Mary said, not unkindly. "You've had a great deal to manage." James looked at the ledger, at the annotations in his wife's handwriting that laid bare something hiding in plain sight for a year and a half. "I'll speak to him today. If I may suggest, there is enough here for a formal complaint to the county magistrate. The recovered funds, if pursued legally, could offset a significant portion of—" "I know what it could offset." His voice was sharp for just a moment. Then he pulled it back. "Forgive me, you're right. I'll consult with the solicitor." She gathered her papers. "Mary." His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. "You did well." The words came out slightly stiff, as if he was not practiced at saying them. "This was valuable work." Mary looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Fairfield." She did not say, "I did not do it to be told I did well." She did not say, "I did it because this is my home now, and I will not watch it fall apart from the inside." She went back to her work. The months that followed were the busiest of Mary's life. She reorganized the household accounts, with Agnes reducing expenditure by nearly a quarter. She met with the 8 tenant families working the Fairfield land and listened, really listened. She learned which fields were underproducing, which fences needed repair, which drainage problems were killing yield in the eastern acreage. She commissioned the repairs from local craftsmen paying fair wages on time, which was enough of a novelty that word spread quickly through the county. Then came the timber merchant. He had held a supply contract with the estate for a decade and had gradually inflated his rates on the assumption that no one at Fairfield was reading the fine print. Mary read the fine print. She called him to the manor, laid the last 10 years of contracts on the table, and quietly explained what she had found. "I would prefer to continue this business relationship," she told him, sitting very straight while he sputtered. "But I will require the rate adjustment to be retroactive for the past 4 years." The man left that meeting looking somewhat diminished. He also left agreeing to every term Mary had proposed. The estate began to breathe again. The workers noticed. The tenants noticed. The county noticed. People began speaking of Fairfield Manor with a different kind of respect. Not the nostalgic respect given to old names fading out, but the active respect given to something that has found new life. James noticed too. On a Tuesday evening in October, he came to her office. She was at the desk, a lamp close beside her, working through correspondence from the solicitor. He stood in this doorway for a moment before she looked up. "You're still working." "There's still work to do." She set the letter down. "Is there something you need?" He moved to the window, stood with his back to her in the way men do when they are working up to something. "I received a letter from Jennings today about the merchant's bank note. He believes we may be able to negotiate a restructured payment schedule at considerably more favorable terms than the original." "Yes." Mary kept her voice careful. "I had hoped that would be possible once the Hargrove recovery was complete and the tenant arrears were caught up." He turned from the window. "How did you know those were the figures Jennings would need?" Because I read the original loan documents when I arrived, she said. The terms include a provision for renegotiation if the estate demonstrates 3 consecutive months of improved financial performance. I've been preparing the documentation for that application since August. James looked at her. You've been planning this for 3 months? Yes. Without telling me. Mary held his gaze. I was not certain it would work. I didn't want to raise your expectations before I knew the outcome was achievable. A silence. You could have told me you were working on it, James said, and something in his voice was harder to read than usual. You could have asked, Mary replied quietly, what I was working on. The words landed between them in the room's silence. Not cruelly. She had not meant them cruelly. But she had meant them honestly, and honesty between them was still new enough to sting. James looked at the floor. You're right, he said. Then again, quieter. You're right. I should have asked. Something in Mary's chest moved just slightly. Not hope. Something more careful than hope. Something that had learned not to reach too far too fast. The documents will be ready for Jennings by the end of the month, she said. I know they will. His voice was different now, stripped of its professional register. He left. Mary looked at the lamp for a long moment after his footsteps faded down the hallway. She had married a man who did not know her favorite flower. But she was beginning to suspect he was capable of learning. Whether he would choose to was still another question. Winter came early that year, snow before Christmas, heavy and sudden. Mary organized the household for winter provisioning with the same efficiency she applied to everything. Agnes oversaw the larder. The tenant families were checked on. Extra fuel was arranged for those whose stores ran low. Mary went out herself twice, riding behind the estate's oldest groom in the small sleigh delivering supplies to the Calloway family, whose youngest child had taken sick with a chest ailment and whose husband had broken 2 fingers in the first week of the freeze. She came back from the second of these visits to find James standing in the front hall, clearly just returned himself. He looked at her wind-burned pink-cheeked, her driving gloves crusted with snow, an empty basket over her arm. Where have you been? The Calloways. Mary began pulling off her gloves. The child is better. The medicine arrived in time. You went out in this weather. It needed to be done. You could have sent one of the men. I could have. She began unpinning her hat. But when people are frightened and their child is sick and their husband is in pain, they don't need a basket delivered by a stranger. They need someone who knows their name. She set the hat on the hall table. I know their name. James was quiet for so long she thought he would walk past her without another word. Then, Margaret. Mary went still. The child. His voice was slightly strange. Her name is Margaret. She was born the same year my father died. Mrs. Calloway brought her to the manor to show cook because Mrs. Calloway and Agnes grew up in the same village. Mary turned to look at him fully. He had known that story all along, had chosen for whatever complicated reason not to show it. Yes, she said softly. Her name is Margaret. James held her gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded almost formally and walked toward the study. Mary stood in the front hall alone. She had learned something just now. She filed it in the part of her mind that kept track of important things, and she carried it with her through all the weeks that followed into the spring that arrived with warmth and new yield, and the specific quiet thrill of a life that was more than she had bargained for in ways she had not yet found the courage to name. The question lived between them all through April. Mary did not name it. James did not reach for it. And so it remained exactly where it had settled on that evening at the dinner table present. Unnamed, occupying the particular silence that forms between two careful people who have both learned that reaching for something fragile is how you break it. Life at Fairfield Manor, in the spring of 1817, had a rhythm to it now. A real one. Not the hollow routine of a household going through its motions, but the living pulse of a place that had rediscovered its own purpose. The tenant fields were plowed on schedule. The East Drainage project came in 3 days ahead of Mary's projection and $200 under budget. Agnes ran the kitchens with the particular authority of a woman who has been given the respect she always deserved and has blossomed dangerously in it. And Mary. Mary moved through the days with a quiet, contained energy that people had stopped trying to explain and simply accepted. She was at her desk by 7 each morning. She rode the property twice a week, not for pleasure, though she took pleasure in it, but to see with her own eyes what the reports told her on paper. She knew every tenant family by name. She knew which fields needed rotating, which fences were losing the argument with winter, which of the young men on the estate had ambitions worth cultivating, and which had habits worth watching. She knew Fairfield Manor the way a person knows something they have chosen to love. James watched her. He told himself he was watching in the way a man watches any competent associate observing the work, noting the results, filing the information. He told himself the thing that pulled his attention toward her across a dinner table or stopped him in a doorway. When he caught the sound of her voice, in the next room was nothing more than the reasonable attention of a man who has learned to recognize valuable management. He was not entirely convincing himself. On a Wednesday morning in the second week of April, he came to her office door and knocked. She called him in without looking up from the letter she was finishing. He stood just inside the doorway and watched her complete the sentence, her pen moving quickly, her handwriting as precise and unhurried as everything else she did, and then set the pen down and look up. "You rode out this morning," he said. "I did." "The west pasture fence. I saw you speaking with Grady. The posts along the creek boundary need replacing before summer. Grady estimated the timber cost higher than I expected." She picked up a second document, glanced at it, set it aside. "I think he's padding the number. I'm going to bring in an outside estimate before I approve the work." James leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "Grady's been with the estate 15 years, and he knows we have no other immediate option for that kind of work, which is exactly why he's padding the number." Mary's voice was matter-of-fact without sharpness. "I don't think he's being dishonest. I think he's being practical. I intend to be equally practical." James looked at her for a moment. "You don't trust anyone easily, do you?" It was not quite a question. Mary considered it with the seriousness she gave every real question. "I trust people when they've earned it. I verify before I trust. My father called it—" She paused. Something moved across her face, a memory. "He called it the difference between faith and foolishness." "He sounds like a formidable man." "He is. A beat. He also sold his daughter to save a stranger's estate, so his wisdom has its limits." The words came out more plainly than she'd intended. She watched James absorb them, watched the slight tightening across his jaw, the way his eyes didn't flinch, but didn't quite hold steady either. "That's a fair assessment," he said. "I didn't mean it as an attack." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I also know it's true." Mary looked at him. The morning light was coming through the window behind her, and he stood in the doorway with his expression more open than she was accustomed to seeing, the composed mask slightly off-center, showing the edge of something underneath it that she had only glimpsed before. "James." She used his given name deliberately carefully, which was still not a habit between them. "Do you regret the arrangement?" The question sat in the room between them like something breakable. He did not answer immediately. She watched him think. Actually think, not perform the act of considering while preparing a safe response. It was one of the things she had noticed about him in the quieter moments, that when he chose to be honest, he was genuinely honest. The problem was that he chose it rarely. "No," he said finally. "I don't." "That's not a complete answer." One corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "No," he said again. "It isn't." He straightened from the doorframe. "I regret the terms of it. I regret that you were not given a choice. I regret—" He stopped. Then carefully, "I regret that I entered this marriage looking only at what it would provide me, without considering what it would cost you." Mary held his gaze. She had not expected that. She had expected polite deflection, or the kind of gentlemanly non-answer that men of his breeding deployed so skillfully when a direct response felt dangerous. She had not expected honesty this clean or this unsolicited. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was quieter than she'd intended. "Don't thank me for being honest about my own failures," James said, and something in his voice was almost wry. "It's a low bar to clear." He left before she could answer. Mary sat at her desk and looked at the empty doorway for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Because that was what you did when something shifted in your chest and you weren't ready to examine it closely. You went back to work and you let the feeling settle, and you told yourself you would look at it properly when you had time. She never seemed to have time. That was perhaps intentional. The next 2 months moved quickly. Summer came to Fairfield Manor with the particular abundance of a year that has been well prepared for the Eastfield drainage, made the difference the projections had promised, and the yield from the summer planting exceeded anything the estate had recorded in the previous 5 years. Mary reviewed the harvest numbers with Agnes over tea one afternoon in late June, and Agnes set down her cup and said flatly and without ceremony, "Your father-in-law would not recognize this place." "Is that good or bad?" "Good." Agnes refilled both cups. "He was a kind man, not a competent one." A pause. "You are not the kindest person I have ever worked for." Mary raised an eyebrow. "But you are." Agnes continued, meeting her eye with the directness of a woman who has earned the right to speak plainly, the most capable. "And in my experience, capability does more actual good for the people around you than kindness ever managed alone." It was the nearest thing to a declaration of loyalty that Agnes was constitutionally capable of delivering, and Mary understood it as such. "Thank you, Agnes. Don't get sentimental about it. There's a flower order that needs reviewing." Mary almost smiled. She almost smiled a great deal these days, which was something she had not anticipated about life at Fairfield Manor. She had entered the marriage prepared for competent unhappiness. She had not anticipated the small daily satisfactions of work done well, of problems solved, of being known and trusted by people whose respect she had earned rather than inherited. What she had not anticipated, and this was the thing she still could not look at squarely, was James. Not the James of the wedding day, polished and transactional and perfectly composed, but the man who had started appearing in small, unscripted moments. The one who knocked on her office door for reasons that were only half about business. The one who had remembered Margaret Calloway's name and the story behind it. The one who had on a Tuesday evening in May come to stand beside her at the fence overlooking the east field, and said nothing for 10 full minutes, and somehow made the silence feel like company rather than absence. She could not look at it squarely, because looking at it squarely would require naming it. And naming it would require knowing what to do about it, and she did not know. She was not sure she was brave enough to know. James, for his part, was conducting his own unexamined war. He had spent the first 6 months of his marriage maintaining a careful professional distance that he had told himself was appropriate and respectful. He had told himself that Mary deserved not to be complicated by whatever feelings a man might inconveniently develop toward a wife he had chosen for her fortune rather than for herself. He had told himself that the thing a gentleman did in this situation was keep his word, treat her fairly, and ask nothing more of her than what the arrangement had specified. He had been telling himself these things with decreasing success since approximately October. By June, the internal argument had collapsed almost entirely. I was aware of her in the way you become aware of something that has always been present, but which you have only recently learned to see clearly, suddenly and completely, with no ability to return to the prior state of not seeing. He was aware of her voice in another room, of the particular quality of her silence, when she was thinking hard, of the way she rode a horse with the kind of easy authority that came from years of doing it well. He was aware that she was funny when she chose to be, and that she chose to be rarely, and usually at the precise moment when laughter was most needed. He was aware that she was braver than he was, in the specific way that people are brave when they have learned very early to rely only on themselves. I was also aware that he had entered this marriage on terms that gave him very little standing to ask for anything he had not paid for. That awareness was its own particular kind of misery. It drove him in July to do something that he immediately recognized as either very wise or very foolish. He ordered a greenhouse built on the south side of the manor. Nothing extravagant, a working greenhouse for propagating estate plants for growing the kitchen herbs. Agnes had complained about sourcing through the winter. A practical addition. He filled it with lilacs. He did not announce this. He did not explain it. He simply had the work done, and when it was finished, he left the door unlocked and said nothing. Mary found it on a Thursday morning. She had gone around the south side of the house following up with the groundskeeper about a drainage issue. She was always following up about something, and she pushed open the greenhouse door and stopped. The smell hit her first. Green and alive and sweet. And then she saw them, the lilac cuttings in their rows of clay pots, young and just beginning to reach, filling the glass-walled space with the particular wild promise of something that has not bloomed yet, but intends to. She stood very still for a long moment. Then she turned and went to find James. Howe was in the stable yard, which was where he went when he needed to think, checking over the tack with the groom, in the way he had been doing since he was 12 years old, and trouble made him want to be near horses. He heard her cross the yard. He knew her footsteps. "The greenhouse," she said, and her voice was not its usual even-measured self. It was something slightly different, something he had not heard in it before. He turned. Mary stood 6 feet from him, with the morning sun behind her, and her arms at her sides, and her expression doing something complicated that her expression rarely did. "You remembered," she said. He held her gaze. "You mentioned it once, your first week here. You said lilacs were your favorite, and that you missed having them close." "I mentioned it once, to Agnes, in the kitchen. Agnes mentioned it to me." Mary was quiet for a moment. "You asked Agnes what my favorite flower was." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." "When?" "December." A pause. "Right around the time I realized I should have asked you myself, before the wedding." The stable yard was quiet. Somewhere beyond the fence a bird called twice and went silent. Mary pressed her lips together for just a moment, the gesture he had come to recognize as the one she made when something caught her off guard, and she was deciding how to respond to it. "James, you don't have to say anything." His voice was careful, even. "I'm not asking for anything. I just thought—" He stopped, tried again. "I thought you deserved something that was only for you. Not for the estate, not for the accounts, just for Mary." She looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she said, "Thank you." Just those 2 words. The same ones she had said after his apology in her office. But they meant something different this time. He could hear the difference, and he thought she could too. She went back to work. He went back to the tack. And neither of them said anything else about the greenhouse or the lilacs, or what it meant that he had asked Agnes in December and built it in July. But something had shifted. Something real and irreversible had shifted, and that was when the danger began. Not from outside. Not yet. From inside, from the specific vulnerability of 2 people who have been careful for a long time and are beginning in small and unguarded moments to stop. The summer social season in the county brought with it the obligations that James had always managed with efficient courtesy. The dinners, the assemblies at the Drummond estate, the afternoon garden parties that the county families used to maintain their networks and display their standings. Mary attended all of these events beside James, and she found to her own surprise that she was genuinely good at them. Not in the performative, decorative way that society expected of a wife, but in the substantive way that came from actually listening to people and remembering what they said. It was at the Drummond midsummer dinner in the last week of July that she first encountered Charlotte Whitmore. Charlotte Whitmore was the daughter of a prominent Richmond family, recently arrived in the county to stay the summer with her cousin, the Drummond's daughter-in-law. She was 24 younger than Mary by 4 years, with a particular kind of beauty that was assembled with conscious artistry and deployed with great precision. She was charming in the specific way that suggested the charm was both genuine and calculated, which was an unusual and effective combination. She was also, Mary noticed within the first 10 minutes of their introduction, watching James. Not obviously. Nothing about Charlotte Whitmore was obvious. But Mary had learned to read rooms, had been reading them since childhood, sitting at her father's elbow at dinner parties where deals were made in the language of social performance, and she saw what she saw. Charlotte laughed at something the man beside her said, but her eyes moved to James while she was laughing. Charlotte asked the hostess a question about the estate renovation, but her body had angled itself toward James's end of the table. Charlotte was introduced to Mary with perfect grace and warmth, and said all the correct things. "Mrs. Fairfield, what a pleasure. I've heard such wonderful things about the work you've done at the estate," and meant none of it the way it sounded. Mary filed all of it away without expression. After dinner, she found James on the terrace where the men had gathered after the meal, and she stood beside him and said quietly, while the conversation flowed around them, "The Whitmore girl." James glanced at her. "What about her?" "She's clever." A slight pause. "She seems agreeable enough." "Agreeable is not the same as clever," Mary said. "She's clever, and she's decided she finds you interesting." James turned to look at her more directly. "Mary, I'm not accusing you of anything." Her voice was perfectly even. "I'm observing. You may find the observation useful." He studied her face for a moment with an expression she could not fully read. "And if I do find it useful," he said slowly, "what would you have me do with it?" She met his gaze. "Whatever you think is right," she said. And then she turned back to the party because she was Mary Fairfield, and she did not allow herself to beg for anything. The drive home from the Drummond dinner was quiet for the first several miles. The night was warm, the roads clear, and James handled the reins himself, which he preferred when he had something to think about. "She's very beautiful," Mary said, when the silence had gone on long enough to become its own kind of statement. James didn't look at her. "Yes." "And she admires your title, your position, the Fairfield name." "It seemed that way. She would never ask you about the drainage reports." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. "No," he agreed. "She probably wouldn't." Silence again. The horses moved steadily through the dark. "Mary." His voice was different suddenly, lower, more honest than he usually allowed himself in motion. She looked at him. "For what it's worth," James said, and he kept his eyes on the road. "I know the difference." Her heart did something she was not going to examine tonight. "Between what?" she asked very carefully. "Between what's admirable," he said, "and what's extraordinary." The words fell into the dark between them and stayed there. Mary did not respond. She could not respond, not safely, not without saying something that would crack the careful architecture of the life they had built together and expose everything she had been keeping precisely structured and controlled for the past 15 months. So she said nothing, and James did not push. And they drove home through the summer dark to Fairfield Manor, which smelled of lilacs and growing things, and both of them carried something they were not yet ready to name. The problem with not naming things is that other people will eventually name them for you. Charlotte Whitmore was in the county for 6 weeks. In that 6 weeks, she attended 4 social events at which James was also present. She was gracious to Mary at every one of them, perfectly deliberately gracious in the way that made it impossible to object to anything specific while making the overall intention impossible to misread. James was courteous to her. He was courteous to everyone. It was one of his most deeply ingrained habits, and it could not be taken as evidence of anything in either direction. But Mary watched him in those rooms. She watched him in the way she watched everything carefully, without announcing the watching. And what she saw was not what frightened her. What frightened her was more specific and more painful than that. She watched James with Charlotte, and she saw a man being admired without complication. A man being seen as what he was on the surface. Handsome, distinguished, the holder of a fine name, without the accompanying weight of everything that had gone wrong. Without the debt. Without the failures. Without the Hargrove ledgers and the restructured banknotes and the tenant arrears. Without all the evidence of how close he had come to losing everything. Charlotte Whitmore looked at James Fairfield and saw something uncomplicated and desirable. Mary looked at him and saw all of it. The whole real thing, the good and the terrible, and the recovering, and she knew that the whole real thing was what she loved, which was the first time she had used that word even silently, even only to herself. She loved him. She had not intended to. It had happened in exactly the way she had been careful not to let it happen, assembled from small pieces over many months until it was complete before she noticed. And now she was standing in Elizabeth Drummond's parlor, watching a beautiful girl from Richmond tilt her head at her husband and wondering if he was about to give her the thing he had never given Mary, the thing that could not be bought or contracted or arranged between fathers, his own free, uncomplicated choice. She went home from that party and sat in her office and did not work. She sat at her desk and did not work, which was something she could not remember doing since the early days of her marriage. She sat there until the clock read 10, and then she went to bed, and she stared at the ceiling of the room that was hers, but had never felt entirely like hers, and she made herself look at the truth she had been avoiding. She had fallen in love with a man who had bought her, and she had no earthly idea whether he would ever think to choose her. The following morning, James appeared at her office door at 9 o'clock, which was unusual. She had been working for 2 hours already. He knocked once and came in without waiting for her response, which was also unusual. He sat down in the chair across from her desk without being invited, which had never happened before. Mary set down her pen. "Charlotte Whitmore is leaving the county on Friday," James said. Mary kept her expression neutral. "Is she? Her cousin has arranged an escort to Richmond. She mentioned it at the Harton reception last night." He paused. "I did not attend the Harton reception." "I know. You were in the North Field with Grady." "I was in the North Field with Grady," he confirmed, looking at the fence post you made him requote. A pause. "You were right about the padding, by the way. The outside estimate came in 30% lower." "I know. I approved the work this morning." James looked at her across the desk. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want you to let me finish before you redirect the conversation to the fence posts or the harvest figures or anything else practical." Mary's pulse was doing something it was not supposed to do. "All right," she said. He leaned forward slightly. "When we married, I told you I would be fair. I told you that like it was the best I had to offer." His voice was careful, deliberate the way it always was when he was saying something he had actually prepared. "I have spent the past 15 months watching you be extraordinary, not because the contract required it, not because your father's money built in the expectation, but because that is simply who you are. And I have spent those same 15 months hiding behind courtesy and professional regard, because I did not think I had earned the right to anything else." Mary did not move. "Charlotte Whitmore is a lovely woman," James continued, "and she made it very clear that she found me compelling. And do you know what I thought every single time at every one of those dinners?" He held her gaze. "I thought she doesn't know the drainage report. She's never sat in Agnes's kitchen with a ledger. She's never ridden out in a snowstorm to bring medicine to a sick child. She admires the title. You built what the title stands for." The room was absolutely still. "James?" Her voice came out differently than she'd intended, stripped of its usual even control. "I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel." He was precise even now, even in this. "I know this marriage was not your choice. I know I have no standing to ask for more than what was agreed. But I—" He stopped, looked at his hands briefly, looked back up. "I could not continue without telling you that I see you. Not the asset, not the manager, not Mrs. Fairfield of Fairfield Manor." His voice dropped to something quieter. "You, Mary." She looked at him across the desk. All her life, she had been the practical one. The one who read the ledgers and solved the problems and kept her own feelings organized in neat, manageable columns. The one who did not reach for things she was not certain she could hold. She was not entirely sure in this moment that she could hold this. "You have terrible timing," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. Something opened in his expression, something careful and hoping. "I know," he said. "I'm in the middle of approving the West Fence contract." "I know that too." She looked at him for a long moment. "Come back at 7, she said. "After dinner. We'll—" She stopped, tried again. "We'll talk properly." James held her gaze for one more second. Then he stood. 7, he agreed. He left. Mary sat at her desk for a full 2 minutes without moving, without picking up her pen, without doing anything practical at all. She was in love with her husband, and for the first time since she had walked into that chapel in her wedding dress and felt the lilacs were a sign, she thought perhaps the sign had been telling the truth. She picked up her pen. She approved the West Fence contract, and she counted the hours until 7. She was at 5 when the letter arrived from London, a letter addressed to James, A letter that, because it arrived, opened the seal, having broken in transit. The contents visible to the housemaid who brought it directly to Mary, in the assumption that she handled all correspondence, a letter that Mary read by accident in the time it took to recognize it was not meant for her. She read it once. She read it again. Then she set it on her desk, very precisely, face down, and sat for a while in a silence that had a completely different quality from the silence of 7 minutes ago. The letter was from a solicitor in London. It was about a new investment venture, a shipping consortium, a very large investment, and the collateral. James had offered, without discussing it with her, without mentioning it, without so much as a word, was the East acreage. The field she had drained. The field that had produced the best harvest in 5 years. The field she had rebuilt with her own hands and her own planning. He had offered it to a London consortium without telling her, as if it were simply his to offer, as if nothing had changed, as if she were still simply the fortune he had purchased. Mary sat with that truth for a long time. She was very quiet. She was still. And when 7 o'clock came, she was not in the parlor. She was in her office with the lamp burning low and the letter in front of her, wondering if she had been wrong about everything. 7 o'clock came and went. James sat in the parlor for 20 minutes before he accepted that Mary was not coming. He had chosen his chair carefully, the one near the window, not the one behind the desk, because this was not meant to be a business conversation, and he had wanted the room arranged to say so. He had told the housemaid to bring tea. He had not touched it. He sat with his hands loose in his lap and listened to the clock on the mantel, mark the minutes in the particular relentless way clocks have when you are waiting for something important. At 7:20, he stood up. I went to her office. The lamp was burning low. Mary was at her desk. She did not look up when he came to the doorway, which was wrong, she always knew. When someone entered a room, it was one of her habits, the alertness of a woman who had always been the one responsible for knowing what was happening around her. She was looking at something on the desk. Mary. He came into the room. It's past 7. I know what time it is. Her voice was level, careful. The voice she used in professional meetings, not the voice from this morning, not the voice that had said, "Come back at 7" with something unsteady in it. He came closer, saw the paper on the desk, recognized the handwriting on the back of it, the solicitor's firm, London, the particular formal script of Alderman and Whittle. Everything in his chest went cold. He did not reach for the letter. He did not need to read it. He knew exactly what it said, and the knowledge of what it said landed in him like something physical. The specific sick impact of being caught not in a lie, but in an omission, which was in some ways worse. When did that arrive? His voice came out quieter than he intended. This afternoon. Mary lifted her eyes from the desk to his face, and what was in them was not what he had expected. Not anger, or not only anger. Something more controlled, and therefore more devastating. The seal had broken in transit. The housemaid thought it was estate correspondence. Mary. The East acreage. She said it the way she said numbers in a ledger. Precise, without inflection. The field we drained last winter. The field that produced 30% above projection this summer. You offered it as collateral to a London shipping consortium. I was going to tell you. When? The word was sharp. Just the one word, and then she pulled it back and returned to the level tone. When were you going to tell me? James moved to the chair across from her desk, the same chair he had sat in this morning 12 hours ago when he had said things he had been preparing for weeks. He sat down. After the terms were confirmed, he said, I didn't want to raise the question of risk until I knew the investment was sound. That is exactly what you told yourself. Mary folded her hands on the desk. And that is almost word for word what you told yourself about every decision you made before I came to this estate. You didn't want to look at the Hargrove ledgers too closely until you knew the situation was manageable. You didn't want to address the tenant arrears until the numbers forced you to. You have a very consistent habit, James, of not telling people things until you've already decided how it ends. He absorbed that. He could not argue with it because it was true. The investment is sound, he said. Jennings reviewed it. The consortium has 3 successful voyages recorded. I don't doubt the investment. Her voice cut through, still level. I doubt the process. I doubt the fact that you made a decision about this estate's primary collateral without one conversation. One. She paused. We have worked on these accounts together for over a year. You have come to my office and consulted me on fencing contracts and timber suppliers and drainage schedules. But when the decision involved real money, London money, shipping money, a kind of investment that your father would have made, you made it alone. The silence stretched. Because it felt like mine to make, James said. The words came out before he'd fully formed them, and he heard them as she must have heard them, honest in a way that made everything worse. Mary looked at him. Yes, she said quietly. That is exactly the problem. She stood. She moved to the window, not to look out of it, just to have somewhere to be that wasn't directly across from him. This morning you told me you saw me, she said with her back still to him. Not the asset, not the manager, you. She stopped. Drew a breath. And tonight I find that when a significant financial decision needed to be made about this estate, the estate I have spent every working hour of the past 16 months rebuilding, you looked at it and thought, this is mine, and you acted accordingly. She turned back around. Which one is true, James, because I cannot hold both of them at once. He looked at her across the room. He wanted to argue. He wanted to explain that the two things were not mutually exclusive, that a man could genuinely see a woman and still have deeply ingrained habits of authority that operated underneath the intention, that this was not a contradiction of feeling, but a failure of practice. He wanted to say all of that. He also knew it would sound like exactly what it was, a man making excuses for the specific injury that he had caused. Both are true, he said instead. I meant every word I said this morning, and I also failed you tonight. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I don't get to use one to cancel out the other. Mary was very still. No, she said finally. You don't. The clock on the desk ticked. What do you want me to do? He asked. About the investment. About any of it. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was doing something complicated. He had learned to watch for it, the slight tension around her eyes when she was deciding how honest to be. I want you to withdraw the collateral offer, she said. Not because the investment is wrong, because the process was wrong. If you want to pursue it, we discuss it together as we discuss everything else. Done. He said it immediately. I'll write to Jennings tonight. She nodded once. And the other thing? His voice was careful. She knew what he meant. I don't know yet, she said. And it was the most honest answer she could give him. He nodded. He stood. I'm sorry, Mary. No qualification. No explanation appended. Just the words, clean and direct. She held his gaze. I know you are, she said. He left. She did not go to bed for a long time. She sat in the office with the lamp burning down and thought about the specific cruelty of caring for someone who is still in the process of becoming who they need to be. How you cannot rush it. How you cannot do it for them. How you can only watch and decide day by day whether what they're becoming is worth what the waiting costs you. She had her answer. She was simply not ready to say it aloud yet. 3 days passed without the conversation resuming. Not because they avoided each other. They did not. Life at Fairfield Manor did not allow for avoidance. They sat at the same table for meals. They discussed estate business with the same professional efficiency they always had. James had written to Jennings the night of the argument as promised, and shown her the letter before it was sealed, not as performance, but as proof that he understood what had shifted. She had read it, nodded, said nothing more about it. But something was different between them now, and both of them could feel it. Not the cold distance of the early marriage. This was different. This was the specific tension of two people who have said real things to each other and cannot go back to the performance of not having said them. It was on the fourth morning, a Thursday, when Agnes appeared at the breakfast table with an expression that signaled the delivery of information Mary was not going to enjoy. Mrs. Harton called yesterday afternoon while you were with the solicitor, Agnes said, refilling the teacups with the focused attention of a woman who knows she is about to say something unwelcome. Mary looked up. She called to inform me. Agnes's voice was carefully neutral. The neutrality of a woman who considers it beneath her to gossip, but will absolutely pass along relevant intelligence that Miss Whitmore has extended her stay in the county. James set down his coffee cup. The table was quiet. "By how long?" Mary asked. Mrs. Harton was not specific, but she mentioned that Miss Whitmore had expressed a particular interest in attending the Drummond Autumn Assembly. Agnes paused. "Which is 3 weeks from Saturday." "Thank you, Agnes," Mary said. Agnes retreated to the kitchen with the particular dignity of a woman who has fulfilled her duty and will say nothing further on the subject. Mary looked at her plate. James looked at Mary. "Charlotte Whitmore staying in the county has nothing to do with—" "I know." Mary's voice was even. "Mary. James." She looked up. "I'm not concerned about Charlotte Whitmore." "Then what are you concerned about?" She held his gaze across the breakfast table. "I'm concerned," she said carefully, "about whether this marriage as it is right now between the two of us is something we are both choosing, or whether it is still simply something we are both managing." The question landed between the breakfast things with all its weight. James was very still. "I am choosing it," he said. "Then show me." Her voice did not waver. "Not with words, not with letters to solicitors, though I appreciate that. Show me in the way you think about this estate, about the decisions that affect it, about who belongs in those decisions." She paused. "Show me that you are choosing me. Not because of what I provide. Because of who I am." She pushed back from the table. "I'm going to the North Field with Grady," she said. "The fence work is halfway done, and I want to see the progress." She left him at the breakfast table. James sat with his coffee going cold, and the specific sensation of a man who has been given both a challenge and a direction, and who understands that the only acceptable response to either is action rather than argument. He sat there for less than 5 minutes before he stood up. He went to the North Field with her. He did not announce his arrival. He simply appeared at the fence line where Mary stood with Grady going over the new posts, and he came to stand beside her, and he asked Grady the same questions she had been asking, but from his own angle of knowledge, the structural angle, the longevity of the timber, the depth of the setting. And Grady looked between the two of them with the quietly satisfied expression of a man watching two rivers merge into one. Mary did not comment on his presence, but when they walked back toward the house an hour later, their steps fell into the same rhythm without either of them adjusting for it. And that small unconscious thing said more than either of them had managed with words. The week that followed was the most honest of their marriage. James came to her office in the mornings, not always with a purpose, sometimes simply because he had found himself walking toward it and had stopped pretending he did not know why. He consulted her on 2 separate matters before making any decision which was new and which she noticed without remarking on. He sat beside her at dinner and spoke with her the way people speak when they have stopped performing and started simply being in the same room. He learned things about her he had not known. That she had wanted to study medicine as a girl before her father explained that was not possible, and had redirected the scientific interest into accounts and economics because numbers were the next best thing to something she could actually affect. That she had a sharp, dry humor she deployed mostly when she thought no one was listening. That she had not cried since she was 17 years old, not because she had nothing to cry about, but because she had made a private decision at 17 that the world responded to capability more than to grief, and she had built her entire life on that foundation. He told her things she had not known about him. That he had wanted to leave Virginia entirely when his father died, had applied for a naval commission in a moment of desperate idealism and been talked out of it by his older brother. That he had inherited not just the debts, but the guilt of watching his father's decline, and believing irrationally that a more attentive son might have prevented some of it. That the composure everyone read as confidence was sometimes on the hard days simply the last available option. "You could have told me that," Mary said. They were in the small sitting room after dinner. The fire was low. "Earlier, in the beginning. You were a stranger. And now." He looked at her. Something warm and unguarded in his expression. "Now," he said, "you are the person who knows everything about this estate, and most things about me, and I find that remarkable." Mary looked at the fire. "I find it frightening," she said quietly, "that I care so much about something I did not choose to care about." "Would you undo it?" he asked. "If you could." She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said. He did not move toward her. He did not press. He simply received that answer and held it carefully. "Neither would I," he said. That night, Mary went to bed and lay in the dark and recognized that she had stepped off solid ground entirely. She was in love with him. She had said as much in every way a careful woman can say something without quite saying it, and he had received every word. And this was no longer simply the question of whether love was possible between two people who began as a transaction. This was the question of whether it was safe, whether a man who had spent his entire adult life defaulting to ownership could actually learn to offer partnership instead. She did not yet have the answer. She was about to be forced to find one. The following Monday, Richard Pembroke arrived at Fairfield Manor unannounced. He came in his traveling coach with 2 attendants and an expression that meant he had been thinking hard for several weeks and had arrived at conclusions he intended to implement. Mary met him in the front hall with the composed grace she would have shown any visitor, and he embraced her with the genuine warmth of a man who loves his daughter imperfectly but truly, and then he asked to speak with James. She showed him to the study. She did not go in. She went to her office, and she worked or she performed the motions of working. While downstairs, her father and her husband were in a room with a closed door conducting a conversation she had not been invited to. It was 40 minutes before James came to her. He knocked, came in, closed the door behind him. His face was carrying something controlled, precise, but not quite as controlled as usual. "Your father has made a proposal," he said. Mary set down her pen. "I wants to expand the arrangement." James came to sit, not across the desk this time, but in the chair beside it, the angle of equals, she noted. "He has identified 3 additional commercial investments he believes the Fairfield name would lend credibility to. He's proposing a formal partnership. His capital, our name, shared returns." "Our name," Mary said. "His word." "What were the terms?" "Generous, very generous." James paused. "Particularly the sections regarding your position in the managing partnership. He stipulated specifically that your involvement would be contractually recognized, not as a courtesy, as a legal requirement." Mary was very still. "He stipulated that." "Yes." Something moved in James's expression. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding a very large thing. "He told me, and I'm quoting him precisely because I think you should hear the exact words he said, 'My daughter has rebuilt your estate. If you are man enough to recognize what you have in her, you will not need this clause. But I am putting it in writing because I have learned not to rely on men being man enough.'" The room was very quiet. "My father said that," Mary said, "to my face. In those words. In those words." She looked at her hands for a moment. Richard Pembroke, who had sold his daughter to save a stranger's estate, was now writing her authority into a commercial contract because he had seen what she had done with it. The man who had not given her a choice was now putting her choices in legal language. People were complicated, even the ones who had failed you, especially those. "What did you say to him?" she asked. James held her gaze. "I told him I didn't need the clause," he said. "And then I told him to put it in anyway." Mary blinked. "You told him?" "I told him you had earned every word of it." His voice was steady, direct. "And that any contract involving this estate should reflect what is actually true, which is that you are not a silent partner in this marriage or in this property, and that I should have made that clear in writing a year ago." Something cracked open in Mary's chest. She did not let it show. She was still Mary. She did not let things show until she had decided to let them show, and even then, she controlled the timing. But the crack was there, spreading quietly through everything she had kept carefully structured, and she felt it. "You said that to my father," she said. "I said it to your father." He leaned forward slightly. "I would have said it in the county square if it would have been useful." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "What do you actually want, James?" No more careful language. No more precise professional phrasing. Just the question direct and unmediated. He did not look away. "I want a marriage," he said. "Not an arrangement, not a management partnership. A marriage, with you, specifically with you." A pause. "I know I have given you very little reason to trust that. I know the East acreage and every decision before it made this harder than it should be. But I am asking you not because of the contract, not because of your father's money, not because of what you provide to this estate." His voice dropped to something quieter. "Because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I have been a fool about it for 16 months, and I would like very much to stop being a fool." The clock on the desk ticked. Mary breathed. And then, before she could form a response, before she could decide whether this was the moment to be brave or the moment to be careful, Agnes knocked once and opened the door with the particular urgency that meant something had happened that could not wait. "Mrs. Fairfield." Agnes's voice was tight. "The East Field." Mary was on her feet before Agnes finished the sentence. "What happened?" "Grady sent the boy up. One of the new drainage channels, the winter work. There's a structural failure, 3 acres, maybe more. The water's backing up." Mary was already moving past her into the hallway. The East Field. The field she had drained. The field James had offered as collateral. The field that had produced 30% above projection and represented the clearest proof of everything she had built here. She did not look back at James. She was already gone. Howe was right behind her. They rode out together, James calling for the horses, while Mary was already pulling on her riding gloves, neither of them wasting a word on anything that wasn't the immediate problem. The groom had the horses out in under 3 minutes, which was a record, and they went at a hard canter across the south pasture toward the eastern boundary. Grady met them at the field edge, his face tight with the particular misery of a man who has watched something go wrong and has been waiting to explain himself. "The 4th channel," he said, pointing. "The stone lining we put in the bedrock shifted in last week's rain. Cracked the base. Water's coming up through instead of running off." Mary looked at the field. She could see it, the standing water already spreading along the depression between the 2nd and 3rd planting rows, dark and still, where it should not have been. "How fast is it spreading?" "Not fast. But if it rains again before we fix the lining." "It rains again Thursday." She had checked the weather reports with the almanac 2 days ago. "We have 2 days." She turned to James. "I need every available hand on the estate. Stonework, not timber. We need to reline the base of that channel before Thursday." "The workers from the north fence." "Pull them. The fence can wait." He was already turning toward Grady. "Get everyone you can reach. Tell them Mrs. Fairfield needs them by noon." Grady's eyes moved between them, the same quick assessment he had done at the fence line 2 weeks ago, and then he went. Mary was already calculating. Stone. Sand. The depth of the original lining. Whether the bedrock crack was isolated or extended. She ran through the variables quickly, the way she ran through everything, not anxiously, but purposefully, because panic was a waste of resource, and she had learned that early. "The Calloway brothers," she said half to herself. "They did stonework before the eldest took the tenancy. I need to talk to them directly." "I'll go." James said it before she could. She looked at him. "I'll go," he repeated. "You stay and direct the channel assessment. I'll bring the Calloways back myself." She held his gaze for a moment. "The eldest brother is proud," she said. "He won't respond well to a direct request framed as urgency. Tell him you need his expertise. Tell him it's a job that requires someone who actually understands drainage stone, not just someone who follows directions." James absorbed this. "Anything else?" "Yes." A pause. "Tell him Mrs. Fairfield sent you. Not Mr. Fairfield. It will go faster." Something flashed in his expression, not offense, but something closer to rueful recognition. "Understood," he said. He went. Mary turned back to the field and got to work. She spent the next 4 hours in the field with the estate workers, directing the assessment, mapping the extent of the crack, organizing the stone delivery from the estate's supply yard. She did not oversee from a distance. She was at the channel edge with the workers making decisions in real time, adjusting the plan as the ground revealed what the plan had not accounted for. James returned with both Calloway brothers at 2 o'clock. The eldest, a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Edward, looked at the channel, asked Mary 3 precise technical questions, listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man who respects competence, and said, "You'll need to go deeper than the original lining. The bedrock isn't flat, it's angled. The water's following the angle." "How much deeper?" 8 inches at the low point, maybe 10. "Can we do it in 2 days?" "If we work tonight." "Then we work tonight." Edward Calloway nodded once. The kind of nod that means understood, agreed, no further discussion required. They worked until dark. Then they worked by lamplight. James worked beside her, not directing, not supervising. Working. Carrying stone, mixing the sand and lime, doing what needed doing without commentary or complaint or any of the authority of ownership. He worked because the field needed the work, and because Mary was working, and because after 16 months, he was finally learning what it meant to be beside someone rather than above them. At 10 o'clock, Mary straightened up and looked at what they'd done. "Rest until 4, she told the workers. "We'll start again at first light." She looked at James. He was dirty, tired, and had a cut on his left hand from a stone edge that he had wrapped in a piece of cloth without stopping. She reached out, took his hand before she'd decided to, turned it over to look at the cut. "This needs to be cleaned." "It's fine." "It will be fine after it's cleaned." She kept hold of his hand, did not let go. He looked down at her hand on his. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "James." Her voice was very quiet. "Yes." "I'm going to need time," she said, "to trust this completely. I want to be fair to you. I know you are trying, I see it clearly. But I have spent my entire adult life being the person who cannot afford to be wrong, who checks everything twice because the cost of being wrong falls hardest on me." She paused. "I need time to unlearn that. In relation to you." He was very still. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying no." Her voice was steadier now. "I'm saying I'm still here. I'm still choosing to be here. But I need you to be patient with how long it takes me to be sure." James looked at her hand still holding his. "I have waited 16 months, he said, "to earn the right to ask anything of you. I can wait as long as it takes." She held his gaze. She let go of his hand, but she did not step away. They walked back toward the house together in the dark, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, far enough apart to still be careful. And that was where they were in that particular space between reaching and arriving when the rain came 3 days early and changed everything. It started at midnight. Not the gentle rain of the almanac's Thursday prediction, but the hard driving rain of a storm that had shifted course offshore and arrived with no consideration for human plans or newly relined drainage channels. Mary was woken by the sound of it, heavy on the roof, sudden and total, and she was out of bed and dressed before the housemaid came to knock on her door. She went to the window first. She could not see the east field from her room, but she could hear the rain and she could do the mathematics in her head, and the mathematics were not reassuring. She was in the hallway when she nearly collided with James, who was also dressed, heading somewhere with the particular velocity of a man who has done the same mathematics. They looked at each other in the dark hallway. "The fourth channel," she said. "I know." Edward Calloway said 10 inches deep at the low point. "I know, we set it at 12. She blinked. "You set it at 12. "When you went to talk to the Harton workers at 6 o'clock. I asked Edward if there was margin for error. He said, 'Go 2 more inches.' We went 2 more inches. The rain hammered the roof. Mary looked at him in the dark hallway. He had made a decision about the field, without asking her, but he had made the right decision. And he had made it because he was paying attention. Because he had listened to the same expertise she had listened to and drawn the same cautious conclusion. The line between ownership and stewardship. The line between deciding for someone and deciding with someone in mind. "Come on," she said. They went together through the rain to the east field. Edward Calloway was already there, which did not surprise Mary at all, because Edward Calloway was the kind of man who woke when it rained and went directly to the thing he had built to see whether it held. It held. The channel ran fast and dark, with the sudden load of water pushing hard against the new stone lining. There was one moment about 20 minutes after they arrived, standing in the rain, watching the flow, where the water level climbed high enough that Mary's whole body tensed for the failure. The stone held. Edward Calloway said nothing. He simply gave one short nod and began walking back toward the tenant cottage, pulling his coat collar up against the rain. Mary stood at the edge of the field in the pouring dark. James stood beside her. "It held," he said. "It held." She exhaled. The rain fell around them steady and cold, and neither of them moved toward shelter. "Mary." His voice was close. Quiet. She turned to look at him. He was soaked. She was soaked. The field was running with water, and the night was dark, and the storm was still going, and none of that was the point. "I know it's not enough," he said. "One right decision, I know, James. But I want you to know," he said, "that the extra 2 inches, I did not do it because I thought you would be pleased. I did not do it to demonstrate anything." His voice was very steady. "I did it because it was the right thing for the field. Because you had put months into that field, and the field deserved every protection we could give it." He paused. "I am starting to understand the difference between protecting something because it's valuable to you and protecting something because it deserves to be protected." She looked at him standing in the rain with water running down his face and his ruined coat and his honest eyes, and something in her chest that had been holding itself very carefully for 16 months simply gave. Not collapsed, not broken. Gave in the way that a fist gives when it finally opens, not from defeat, but from the decision that holding on has become more painful than letting go. She said his name. Just his name. Nothing else. And James Fairfield, who had bought a marriage and spent 16 months learning what it actually cost, stepped toward his wife in the pouring rain and understood for the first time what it meant to be chosen by someone who had absolutely every reason not to choose him. But the moment his hand reached for hers, the moment the distance between them shrank to nothing, a rider came hard and fast across the south pasture, with a lantern swinging wild in the rain, calling James's name into the dark. James turned. Mary's hand almost held, was not held. The rider pulled up 20 feet short of them, breathing hard, rain-soaked and urgent. "Mr. Fairfield." The young man was one of the county post riders, barely 18, his voice high with whatever he was carrying. "Letter from London, sir. Marked urgent. Alderman and Whittle." He held out a sealed envelope. James took it. He did not open it. He looked at it in the lantern light, and then he looked at Mary, and his expression was entirely unreadable for the first time in weeks. "Open it," she said. He broke the seal. He read, "In the rain, in the dark, standing at the edge of the field that had held through the storm." James Fairfield read a letter from his London solicitor, and his face changed. Mary watched it change. "What is it?" she asked. He lowered the letter slowly, and when he looked at her, she understood, before he said a word, that the thing she was about to hear was going to require everything she had spent 16 months building, every ounce of strength, every life she had fought to recover and keep. "It's about your father," he said. The letter was 4 sentences long. Mary read it once over James's shoulder in the rain, and then she took it from his hands and read it again, because the first time she had read it with her eyes, and the second time she read it with her whole body, feeling each word land separately. Richard Pembroke had suffered a collapse 3 days prior, in his Charleston offices. The physician described it as an episode of the heart, serious, possibly critical, and the senior clerk at the Pembroke Trading House had written to Alderman and Whittle in London, because they were the closest legal connection to the family, and Alderman and Whittle had forwarded it immediately to Fairfield Manor, marked urgent. Mary lowered the letter. The rain was still falling. The field was still holding. James was still standing beside her with his coat soaked through and his expression very careful, watching her face the way a man watches something he cannot fix and has to witness anyway. "I need to go to Charleston," she said. "Yes." "Tonight, if the road—" "I'll arrange the coach." He was already turning toward the house. You have time to pack a traveling bag. I'll have the horses ready in 20 minutes. James. She caught his arm. He stopped. She looked at him in the lantern light, the rain between them, the letter in her hand. Come with me, she said. It was not a request she had planned. It came from somewhere underneath, planning from the part of her that had spent 3 years learning to need no one, and had recently, against all prior intention, learned to need one person. Something shifted in his face. I'll have the coach ready in 15, he said. They were on the Charleston Road by 1 in the morning. The coach moved fast through the rain-soaked dark, and Mary sat with her hands in her lap and her mind running through 2 separate tracks simultaneously. The practical track that inventoried what she knew about her father's health and what the physician's language suggested, and what would need to be managed in the Pembroke trading house if Richard was incapacitated. And the other track, the one she could not discipline, that was simply the wordless animal fear of losing the person who, for all his failures and all his imperfect love, was still her father. James sat across from her. He did not offer comfort she had not asked for. He did not fill the silence with words that would have made him feel useful, but would have cost her concentration. He was simply present steadily, without demand, in the way she was only beginning to understand he was capable of being. At some point past 3 o'clock, the rain eased. The road smoothed. The motion of the coach shifted from urgent to merely purposeful, and Mary found herself looking at James across the dark interior, and thinking with the particular clarity that exhaustion sometimes delivers, that she had spent her entire life inside her own self-sufficiency, the way other people lived inside houses. It kept her dry, and it kept her safe, and it had never until now felt like a limitation. He'll be all right, James said quietly, not as a promise, as the thing you say when someone needs to hear a human voice say something directed at the specific fear. You don't know that. No, he agreed. I don't. She looked at him. He put me in a contract, she said. And he also, she stopped, tried again. He also went into your study and told you to recognize what you had in me. He is both of those things at once. I have never known what to do with that. You love him anyway, James said. That's what you do with it. She looked at the window for a moment. Yes, she said. That is apparently what I do. They arrived in Charleston at 7:30 in the morning. The Pembroke house on Meeting Street was a place Mary had grown up in, and walking through its front door, with travel dust on her coat and fear in her chest, made her feel simultaneously very young and very old. The housekeeper, Mrs. Drummond. Not the same Drummond as the county family. Just the same name. A coincidence that had always slightly amused Mary, met them in the front hall, with the tight expression of a woman managing a crisis, and grateful to see someone arrive who looks capable of sharing the load. He's awake, Mrs. Drummond said immediately. The physician was here an hour ago. He says the episode was serious, but the heart is strong. He believes with rest, proper rest, which your father is already arguing against. Of course he is. Mary was already moving toward the stairs. Mrs. Fairfield. Mrs. Drummond's voice stopped her. He has been asking for you since yesterday morning. Mary went still for just a moment. Then she went up. Richard Pembroke looked smaller in his bed than she had ever seen him. That was the first thing that struck her, the way illness has of reducing a large man. Not in any way you could measure, but in some essential quality of occupation, as if the body has pulled everything back to the center to concentrate on the work of recovery and left the periphery temporarily untenanted. He was propped against 3 pillows. He was pale. His hands, which had always been the hands of a man who moved things in the world, were folded quietly on the counterpane. His eyes were open and entirely alert. There she is, he said when Mary came through the door. She crossed the room. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She took his hand, the right one, the one that had signed the contract, that had sold her, the one that had also written into that same contract, the clause that protected her authority, and she held it. You frightened me, she said. I frightened myself. His voice was rougher than usual, drier, but the characteristic directness was intact. The physician tells me I must rest. I have told the physician that resting is not in my nature, and he has told me that nature will have to make adjustments. A pause. He may be right. He is definitely right. Richard looked past her to the doorway where James had stopped, uncertain whether to come further in. Fairfield. Richard's voice was assessing. You came. Of course, James said. Mary asked you, or you came of your own account? A beat. She asked, James said. I was going to come regardless. Richard Pembroke looked at him for a long moment, with the eyes of a man who has spent 40 years reading people across negotiating tables. Sit down, Richard said. Both of you. We need to talk about the business. Mary and James exchanged a glance. She could read at that glance, the slight lift of his brow, that meant your father is 3 days out from a cardiac episode, and he wants to discuss business. Her slight return expression that meant, yes, I know this is who he is. They sat. The trading house, Richard said. I have 3 senior clerks. Good men, competent, but not one of them has the authority to make the decisions that will need to be made in the next few months. Shipments arriving, contracts due for renewal, a supplier in Baltimore who has been testing our patience for 2 years and needs to be replaced. He looked at Mary. I need someone in this office. Mary understood what he was saying before he finished. Papa, not permanently. He held up one hand. 2 months, perhaps 3, long enough for me to recover properly and return to full capacity. His eyes did not leave her face. You know this business. You grew up inside it. You are the only person I trust to make the decisions I would make. Mary looked at her father's hand in hers, at the papery skin and the prominent veins, and the evidence of 53 years of a man who had never stopped moving until 3 days ago. The estate, she began. The estate, James said from her left, will be managed. She turned to look at him. I know what needs to be done, he said, and his voice was steady and direct, and carried none of the defensiveness of a man proving something, only the quiet confidence of a man stating what he knows to be true. Agnes knows the household. Grady knows the land. I know the accounts now you've taught me the accounts, Mary. I know them well enough to keep them running for 2 months. A pause. I am not you. I know that. But I am capable of holding it together until you return. She looked at him for a long moment. He was offering her something that cost him something, not the loss of her presence. Though that was real, but the admission that the estate they both lived on was more hers than his in any meaningful sense, and that the right response to her father's need was to step aside and say, go, I have this, I will not let what you built fall apart while you're gone. That was not a small thing for a man who had inherited his entire sense of identity from the concept of ownership. It was, in fact, a very large thing. 2 months, she said to her father. Richard Pembroke's shoulders dropped slightly, the release of a man who has been holding his breath and has finally received the answer he needed. 2 months, he agreed. Maybe less. Mary squeezed his hand once and stood. Rest today, she told him in the tone that brooked no discussion. I'll go to the trading house this afternoon and meet the senior clerks. We'll review the outstanding contracts tonight. Tonight I need to rest. You need to rest. I am going to the trading house. She was already moving toward the door. These are 2 separate activities. Behind her, she heard her father make a sound that was almost a laugh. She heard James make the same sound very quietly. The trading house on East Bay Street smelled the way it had always smelled, salt and timber and paper, and the particular industrial energy of commerce in motion. The senior clerks received Mary with the slightly startled deference of men who had been briefed about her, but had not quite calibrated what briefed meant until she walked in and sat at her father's desk and asked for every outstanding contract file organized by deadline. She had them reorganized, prioritized, and assigned within 3 hours. The clerk named Mr. Firth, who was the eldest and had been with the Pembroke house for 19 years, watched this process from the edge of the room with an expression that evolved from wariness to professional respect to something very close to relief. Mrs. Fairfield, he said when she paused to review the Baltimore supplier correspondence, may I speak plainly? I would prefer it. We have been uncertain since Mr. Pembroke's episode. The men know their work, but decisions have been accumulating that none of us have the authority to make. He paused. You have cleared more in 3 hours than has moved in 3 days. Mary looked at the stack of files in front of her. Then we have a great deal of ground to recover, she said. Let's not waste more time. She worked until 7 that evening. James appeared at this trading house at 6 with food she had not thought to acquire, and the information that her father had slept 4 hours, and the physician was cautiously pleased with his color and pulse. He set the food on the corner of the desk, did not interrupt what she was doing, and sat in the chair against the wall and read the shipping gazette he had found in the front office while she finished the document she was working on. When she finally set down her pen, she became aware all at once of how tired she was. Not the clean tiredness of physical labor, the heavier, duller tiredness of sustained mental effort under emotional weight. She looked at James across the office. He looked up from the gazette. "Done?" he asked. "For today." He closed the gazette and held out her coat. She took it, put it on. And because she was tired, and because her father was upstairs in his bed on Meeting Street, looking smaller than he should, and because James was standing in front of her, with his hand still on the collar of her coat, in the small practical gesture of a man helping his wife into her coat, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Because of all of that, she leaned forward and rested her forehead briefly against his shoulder. Just for a moment. He went very still. Then his hand moved from the coat collar to the back of her head, and he held her there quietly, without pressure, without turning it into anything larger than what it was, which was two people at the end of an exhausting day and a frightening week holding each other up. "Thank you," she said, very quietly, into the wool of his coat. "Always," he said. She straightened, stepped back. Her expression was composed again, not the rigid composure of performance, but the real steadiness of a woman who has been briefly undefended and has chosen to be all right with that. They walked back to Meeting Street together in the evening. Dark, and their hands were close enough that the backs of their fingers touched with every other step, and neither of them mentioned it, and neither of them moved away. The weeks that followed were the hardest Mary had worked since the first winter at Fairfield Manor. The Pembroke trading house was, she discovered, in better shape than her father's collapse had made it appear. But better shape was a relative term, and there were 3 situations in particular that required her full attention and her father's accumulated knowledge applied through her own judgment. The Baltimore supplier was the first. His name was Garrison, and he had been inflating his invoices in the specific way that suggested he had learned somewhere along the way that Richard Pembroke was too busy to read every line and too proud to admit he had missed something. Mary read every line. She called Garrison to a meeting, laid the inflated invoices beside the contracted rates, with the discrepancies annotated in the same precise handwriting she had once applied to Hargrove's ledgers, and told him with perfect courtesy that she expected the overcharges to be credited within 2 weeks, and the future invoices to reflect the contracted terms. Garrison looked at the documents, looked at her, looked back at the documents. "Mr. Pembroke and I have an understanding." "Mr. Pembroke is unwell," Mary said. "His understanding with you is not in writing, which means the written contract governs, which means the contracted rate governs." She closed the folder. "The credit, 2 weeks." Garrison left without further argument. Mr. Firth, who had been standing discreetly near the door, closed it behind him and turned to Mary with an expression of pure professional satisfaction. "Your father is going to be very sorry he missed that," he said. "He'll be insufferably pleased when I tell him about it." Mary agreed. "Which is why I intend to tell him in detail." She did. That evening, sitting at her father's bedside, she told him the whole story, and Richard Pembroke laughed a real laugh, loud and genuine, for the first time since the episode, and then coughed for 30 seconds, and the physician who had been summoned by the sound found him in better color than he'd been in a week. James came to Charleston every 10 days. This was his own arrangement, made without consulting her. She learned about it when he arrived the first time, 10 days after she had settled into the work, with a satchel of estate documents and Agnes's written report of the household accounts, and a package from the greenhouse that contained 3 lilac cuttings wrapped carefully in damp cloth, because he had asked Agnes whether lilac cuttings could be transported, and Agnes had told him they could if handled properly, and James had handled them properly. She held the cuttings in her hands in the doorway of the Meeting Street house and looked at him. "The estate," she said. "How is—" "The east channel is holding. The north fence is complete. The autumn accounts are in order. Agnes sends her opinions on approximately everything. He paused. I have written them all down because I suspected you would ask. He produced a folded document from his coat pocket. She took it, scanned it, looked up. You replanted the damaged row in the east field. Edward Calloway suggested the timing. He was right. You consulted Edward Calloway on his own account. He knows things I don't know. James's voice was simple, direct. I am learning that asking is not a failure of authority. You have known that your entire life. I am somewhat behind you on the lesson. She looked at him standing in the doorway with the estate documents and the lilac cuttings, and she thought about 16 months of careful distance and 16 months of building and the single letter in the rain that had changed the specific quality of everything between them. Come in, she said. My father wants to see you. James went up to Richard Pembroke's room. Mary did not follow. Immediately, she put the cuttings in water and stood in the kitchen for a few minutes with her hands around a teacup, listening to the murmur of voices from upstairs. Her father's voice rougher, but recovering. James's voice quieter. She could not hear what they were saying. She thought perhaps that was as it should be. When James came back downstairs, his expression was carrying something she could not immediately read. Not quite solemn, not quite moved, somewhere in between. He told me something, James said. She waited. He told me that when he arranged this marriage, he believed he was giving you a good life, a secure life. James stopped in the kitchen doorway. He also told me he knew even then that security is not the same as happiness, and that he chose to give you the one he could guarantee, rather than the one he could only hope for. Mary set down her teacup. He told you that. He said, James paused. He said he has watched you rebuild an estate that should have taken a decade and has watched you do it in under 2 years, and he believes you could have built anything. That the estate was simply the thing that was in front of you. He held her gaze. He said the thing he regrets is not that he chose wrong. He regrets that he chose without asking you first. The kitchen was very quiet. Mary looked at the lilac cuttings in their glass of water. My father, she said finally, has always been better at honesty in retrospect than in the moment. Most people are. She looked at James. Including you, she said. Including me. He did not flinch from it. Including me, Mary. Always. She took a breath. I'm not the same person who arrived at Fairfield Manor, she said. That woman arrived prepared to be competent and expect nothing more. She had very specific walls built, for very good reasons. I know. I am not entirely sure those walls are still standing. She said it plainly, like a ledger entry, like a fact in a column. I am not sure whether that frightens me or relieves me. James crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her close enough that she would have had to make a deliberate effort to step back. Mary. His voice was very quiet. I am not asking you to take down the walls. I am asking to be allowed to stand on the same side of them as you. She looked up at him. Her heart was doing the thing she had been refusing to let it do for months. She had spent her whole adult life being the practical one, the capable one, the one who held everything together by sheer force of intelligence and will, and the refusal to need anything she could not provide for herself. She was so tired of providing everything for herself. All right, she said. Just those 2 words. All right. James looked at her for one long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, the same hand he had nearly held in the east field before the rider came with the letter. The hand that had held his the night of the rain, and he held it. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. That was the moment that mattered. Not the conversation, not the declarations, but the simple fact of standing in her father's kitchen with her hand in his, and neither of them doing anything to increase the distance between them. Richard Pembroke was on his feet within 6 weeks, which was 3 weeks earlier than the physician had projected, and exactly when Richard had projected it from his sickbed on day 4. He came to the trading house on a Tuesday morning and sat at his desk, the desk Mary had occupied, and looked at the organized files and the annotated contracts and the resolved supplier situation and the completed Baltimore credit, and said nothing for a long time. Then, "You've done it better than I would have." Mary, standing across the desk, said, That's not true. It is, Richard said. I would have shouted at Garrison. You didn't shout, did you? No. That's better. He picked up a file, set it down, picked up another. 3 months ago, I told Fairfield to put your authority in writing. Has he, in a manner of speaking? In a legal manner of speaking, or in a feeling manner of speaking? Both, she said. He's been managing the estate in my absence and consulting Edward Calloway on drainage questions and keeping Agnes's accounts in order. The East Field produced on schedule. She paused. He comes to Charleston every 10 days. Richard looked at her over the top of the file. He comes every 10 days. Yes. That is a significant journey. Yes, it is. Her father set down the file and looked at her fully. Mary. His voice had dropped the business register and become something else, something she had heard from him, rarely the voice of a man speaking not as a merchant or a strategist, but as a father. Are you happy? The question surprised her. He had asked her once before years ago whether she was happy, and she had given him a practical answer about the adequacy of her circumstances, and he had accepted it because that was the kind of answer they gave each other. Yes, she said. No qualifications, no ledger entries, just yes. Richard Pembroke nodded once. He picked up the file again. He cleared his throat. The Baltimore credit has been applied correctly, he said. Walk me through the remaining supplier situation. Business resumed. But the smile he did not quite manage to suppress stayed at the corner of his mouth for the rest of the morning, and Mary chose not to mention it. She returned to Fairfield Manor on a Thursday in late autumn. James did not know she was coming that day. She had sent a letter the previous week saying she expected to be home by the end of the month, but had not specified the exact date, because the exact date had depended on her father's return to capacity, which had moved faster than expected. She arrived on the afternoon coach alone with 2 traveling bags and the 3 lilac cuttings in their transport cloth, and she came up the drive to Fairfield Manor in the low autumn light and felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt she was coming home, not to an arrangement, not to an estate, not to the professional project she had made of someone else's failing property. She was coming home the way the word is supposed to mean something, the place where what matters most to you is the place where the best version of your life is assembled. Agnes met her at the door. You're early, Agnes said in a tone that meant she was very pleased. My father recovered faster than expected. Of course he did. Agnes took one of the bags. He's too stubborn to stay ill. She turned toward the kitchen with the bag. Then over her shoulder, he's in the East Field. Mary did not need to ask who. She walked to the East Field. James was there with Grady, looking at the final row of autumn planting, speaking in the easy shorthand of 2 men who have worked through a problem together long enough to understand each other's shorthand. He had his coat-off sleeves rolled up in the way she had seen on him on the night of the rain, and he was making a point to Grady, with his hands in the emphatic way people use when they know the land they're talking about and have something specific to say about it. Grady saw her first. His face changed. James turned. He went very still. She was 20 feet away, standing on the edge of the field with her traveling coat on, and the autumn light behind her, and she watched the stillness move through him. Not surprise exactly, but the quality of a man who has been waiting for something without admitting he was waiting, and who has now seen it arrive. Grady found somewhere else to be. The field was quiet. You're early, James said. Everyone keeps saying that. She came toward him. My father recovered faster than expected. How is he? Insufferable. She stopped in front of him. Which is how I know he's well. He looked at her, at the traveling coat and the long journey written in her face, and something else underneath, both the particular light of a person who has made a decision and has arrived on the far side of it. James. Her voice was steady, clear, the voice she used when she knew exactly what she wanted to say. Yes. The East Field looks well. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Edward Calloway gets most of the credit, he said. You consulted him. I did. You held the estate together. I did. She looked at him. You came to Charleston every 10 days, she said. For 6 weeks. Yes. That is a very significant journey. Yes. he agreed quietly. It is. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, immediately warm and certain, the grip of a man who has been waiting to hold something and is not letting go now that it's in his hand. I am choosing this, she said, clearly and deliberately, and with every piece of what I am. Not because I was sold into it. Not because it was the only option. Not because of what this estate needed, or what my father wanted, or what the contract specified. She held his gaze. Because I want this. Because I want you. And I am telling you so plainly, because I have spent my whole life being indirect about the things that matter most to me, and I am finished with that. James looked at her for a long moment. His expression was doing something she had never seen on him before. Not the composed mask, and not the careful openness of the past months, but something wholly unguarded, the face of a man who has braced for so long against the weight of his own failures, that the moment the weight lifts, he does not quite know what to do with the space it leaves. He raised her hand, pressed his lips briefly to the back of it, an old gesture, formal, but not formal now, charged with everything it was not charged with. The first time he had taken her hand in that chapel in the spring of 1816. Mary, he said. His voice was not quite even. I have loved you since October. She blinked. October of last year. October of last year. He was very clear about it. When you rode out in a snowstorm to bring medicine to a child whose name you had learned, and whose situation you had tracked, and who mattered to you for no reason other than that she was a person in need, and you were the person who knew how to help. He paused. I stood in the front hall that evening and watched you come in with snow on your gloves, and I thought I have made a terrible mistake. Not the marriage. The mistake of thinking this was only an arrangement. She looked at him. You have been in love with me for over a year, she said. Yes. And you said nothing. I had no standing. You had... She stopped herself, drew a breath. James, you could have told me. I know that now. He held her gaze. At the time I believed that the one honorable thing I could do, given how this began, given that you were not given a choice, was to not ask for anything I had not earned, even the right to say it. She looked at him for a long, still moment. Then, you are occasionally, she said, very foolish. He laughed. That real laugh surprised, uncontrolled, the one she had heard at the dinner table, and filed away in the place where she kept important things. She was laughing too. And then his arms were around her, and she was in them, and this was the moment. Not the grand declaration, not the rain in the east field, not the letter or the greenhouse, or any single dramatic scene, but this. Both of them laughing in the afternoon light, in the field that she had rebuilt, and he had held, and they had between the two of them made something of together. She turned her face into his shoulder. October, she said, muffled against his coat. October, he confirmed. You could have simply told me. You would not have believed me yet. She considered that. He was, how she had to admit, probably right. The field was quiet around them. The autumn planting was in. The drainage held. The estate that had been failing when she arrived was running, genuinely running, not on the strength of her father's money, but on the strength of two people who had learned slowly and imperfectly, and at considerable cost to both of them, how to work beside each other rather than past each other. She would have stayed there longer. Both of them would have, except that Agnes appeared at the field edge with the particular expression she wore when she considered extended sentiment to be encroaching on dinner time. The meal, Agnes announced to the general vicinity, will be ready in 40 minutes. I mention this as information. What anyone does with the information is entirely their own business. She turned and walked back toward the house. Mary looked up at James. We should go in, she said. In a moment. He kept his arms where they were. Agnes has opinions about everything. We can afford to give her something to have opinions about. The sun was low. The field was still. And in that moment between the work and the evening, between what had been and what was coming, Mary Fairfield understood something she had not understood when she walked down the aisle in that chapel 2 years ago. She had not come to Fairfield Manor as a woman being purchased. She had come as the woman this place had been waiting for. And the man beside her was finally, irreversibly aware of it. The trouble arrived the following morning, before breakfast. Before the day had arranged itself into anything manageable. Before Mary had fully settled into being home. A rider from the county seat with a letter addressed to James, delivered with the urgency of something that has been withheld until the last possible moment and can no longer wait. James read it at the breakfast table. He set it down. He looked at Mary. "There is something I have to tell you," he said. "About the London investment. The one I withdrew the collateral from." She looked at him. "The consortium," she said carefully. "When I withdrew the East acreage as collateral, Jennings replaced it with the secondary offer I had previously reserved." He kept his voice even. Factual. The way she kept her voice when delivering difficult information. The secondary offer was accepted. The investment proceeded. She waited. "The consortium's fourth voyage," James said, "encountered a storm in the Atlantic. Total loss. The ship and cargo both." A pause. 3 weeks ago. The breakfast table was very quiet. "The investment," Mary said, "is gone." He held her gaze. "The collateral attached to it." "What was the collateral, James?" he told her. And Mary Fairfield, who had rebuilt one estate and saved one trading house and held 2 crises together with her bare hands and her intelligence and her absolute refusal to be defeated, looked at her husband across the breakfast table and understood that the next chapter of their life was going to require everything she had. Every single thing. And she was not afraid. The collateral was the manor house itself, not the east acreage, not the south pasture, not any single field or outbuilding or piece of working land that could be separated from the whole and surrendered without destroying what remained. James had offered Fairfield the limestone house, the 16 rooms, the stables, the grounds. The name itself attached to the deed as the secondary collateral against the London shipping investment, and the consortium's legal representatives had accepted it, and the ship had gone down in an Atlantic storm 3 weeks ago with every pound of the investment aboard. Mary sat with that information for a long moment. The breakfast things were still on the table. The tea was still warm. Outside, the autumn morning was going on with complete indifference to the fact that the ground beneath everything she had built for 2 years had just shifted in a way she had not yet calculated the full extent of. "Tell me the exact terms," she said. Her voice was the voice of the trading house. Precise. Controlled. The voice that had faced Garrison across a desk and made him credit 3 years of inflated invoices without raising itself once. James told her. All of it. The full terms, the timeline, the amount, the legal mechanism by which the consortium could make its claim, and the window 8 weeks before that claim could be formally exercised. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You did not tell Jennings to remove the secondary collateral when you withdrew the East acreage." "No." His voice was direct. He was not softening it. "I assumed the secondary offer would not be accepted. The consortium had not responded to it in 6 weeks, and I believe the silence meant disinterest." A pause. "I was wrong." "Did you consider telling me?" "Yes." He held her gaze. "I considered it every time I came to Charleston. I did not tell you because your father was ill and the trading house was in crisis, and I made the decision that one more weight was more than you should carry." He stopped. "I know that was not my decision to make." The room was very quiet. Mary looked at the table. At the breakfast things that were the ordinary furniture of an ordinary morning that had stopped being ordinary in the time it took to read 4 sentences. "James." Her voice was careful. Not cold. Something more complicated than cold. "Yes." "Do you understand," she said slowly, "that this is the same pattern, the same one we talked about in this house at this table before I left for Charleston? You making decisions alone, for reasons that feel protective, that remove my ability to respond while the situation is still manageable." He did not look away. "Yes," he said, "I understand that completely, and I have no defense for it except that I love you and I did not want to give you more pain, and I know that is not enough of a reason." The word landed between them. Love. He had said it once yesterday in the field October. He had said since October, but this was different. This was the word deployed not in a moment of revelation, but in the middle of a hard conversation, as part of an honest accounting of his own failure. Used not as a bid for forgiveness, but as an explanation that acknowledged its own insufficiency. She looked at him. 8 weeks, she said. Yes. Then we have 8 weeks. She stood. I need paper, and I need you to write to Jennings today, not tomorrow, today. Something moved in his expression, not relief because this was not resolved, not remotely resolved, but something that recognized what she was doing, which was the thing she always did. She was turning to face the problem, and she was using the word we. He stood. I'll write the letter now, he said. She was already at the writing desk. They worked through the morning side by side. Mary with the estate accounts, James with the correspondence, both of them moving through the problem, the way she had always moved through problems, which was without wasting a moment on panic and without pretending the situation was better than it was. By noon, she had the full picture. It was not as catastrophic as the first shock of it had suggested, and it was not as manageable as she would have preferred. The consortium's claim, if exercised in full, would require either a payment of $12,000 within 8 weeks or the transfer of the deed to Fairfield Manor. $12,000 against an estate that had spent 2 years climbing out of $64,000 in debt was not a sum that could be produced from the current accounts alone. But Mary had not spent 2 years at this estate without learning every financial instrument available to it. The Merchants' Bank, she said. They were in her office now, both of them, working at the same table, which was something that had taken 2 years to arrive at and felt even in the middle of a crisis correct. The restructured note has 3 years remaining, but there is a provision for a second restructure if the estate can demonstrate. The harvest numbers from this year qualify, James said. He had the bank documents open beside her. He had retrieved them without being asked. The yield from the East Field alone. Not enough, but combined with the South acreage numbers. She pulled the yield report, ran the column. Combined, yes, we qualify for the provision. She looked up. But Jennings will say the bank won't move fast enough. 8 weeks is... Jennings doesn't know the bank manager personally, James said. I do. Henry Whitmore has been a family acquaintance since before my father's decline. I have avoided asking him for anything because... He stopped. Because it felt like admitting failure to someone who knew the family when we were stronger. Mary looked at him across the table. James. Her voice was direct. Is Henry Whitmore a man of integrity? Yes. Is he someone who would help if he understood the full situation? I believe so. Then write to him today, after the letter to Jennings. She held his gaze. Pride is expensive. We cannot afford it right now. He nodded once. He picked up his pen. She watched him for just a moment before returning to her own work. This man who had entered this marriage, looking only at what it would provide him, and who was now under pressure doing the thing that cost him the most personally, without being asked twice. People could change. She had always believed that intellectually. She was beginning to believe it in the way that mattered more in her body, in her chest, in the unreasoning part of her, that made decisions before the reasoning part caught up. The letter to Henry Whitmore went out that afternoon. Jennings arrived from the county seat the following morning, having been summoned by James's express letter, and spent 4 hours with both of them going through the legal options, with the exhaustive care of a solicitor who is being paid to find a solution, and is sufficiently professional to find one even when the situation is difficult. The options were, as Jennings laid them out, 3. A payment arrangement with the consortium, which required their cooperation and was not guaranteed. A rapid liquidation of some portion of the estate's holdings. One of the outer parcels, the timber rights on the northern boundary, which would produce approximately $4,000 and was not sufficient alone. Or the bank restructure, which was the cleanest solution, but required the bank to move on a timeline that was not its default preference. The third option, Mary said when Jennings finished. That is the one we pursue. The other two exist as fallback positions only. Jennings looked at her over his spectacles. He had, in the 2 years since she had first appeared across a desk from him, and shown him the Hargrove annotations, developed a very high opinion of Mary Fairfield's judgment. The bank must agree quickly, he said. Then we make the case compelling enough that quickly becomes possible. She turned to James. The Whitmore letter. Has he responded? Not yet. It went out yesterday. Send a second one today. Personal, not professional. Whatever history there is between your family and his, use it. Not as manipulation, as honest context. She paused. Tell him the truth. The full truth. What the investment was, how it failed, what is at stake, and what we have built here that is worth protecting. Another pause. Tell him to come and see it himself if he needs to. James looked at her. You want me to invite the bank manager to inspect the estate as evidence of its value. I want you to invite a man who knows your family to see what this estate has become. The harvest numbers are on paper. The condition of the land, the organized accounts, the tenant stability, those require a person to see them. She met his gaze steadily. The estate's best argument is itself. Let him see it. It was, Jennings said quietly, gathering his documents. An excellent idea. Henry Whitmore arrived 4 days later. He was a compact, precise man in his late 50s with sharp eyes and the careful manner of someone who has spent his professional life watching other people's financial decisions and has developed strong opinions about the difference between the ones that reflect character and the ones that reflect desperation. He had known the Fairfield family for 3 decades. He had watched the estate decline under the late Earl and had privately written off its recovery as unlikely. He arrived at Fairfield Manor and was met at the door by Agnes, who offered him tea before he had properly removed his coat, and was taken through the household accounts by Mary within the first hour, and was walked through the East Field by James and Edward Calloway before lunch, and sat at the dinner table that evening in a house that was warm and orderly and smelled faintly of lilacs, even in November, because the greenhouse was doing what greenhouses do. He said very little during all of this. He observed. After dinner over brandy in the study, he looked at both of them across the desk. Not at James, alone, not at Mary alone, but at both of them, with the deliberate inclusiveness of a man who has spent the day understanding that both of them are necessary to what he has seen. The estate is remarkable, he said. I want to say that clearly before we discuss terms, because it is true, and it should be said. Mary held very still. The yield numbers you sent me were accurate, Whitmore continued. I had Jennings verify them independently, which I mention not as suspicion, but as due diligence. They are in fact slightly conservative. He turned the brandy glass in his hand. The tenant arrangements you have structured, Mrs. Fairfield, the stability and the payment record. I have rarely seen this standard in an estate of this size. Thank you, Mary said. I am going to tell you something that is technically outside the scope of our professional relationship, Whitmore said. Strictly as a man who has known this family. He looked at James. Your father was a good man who made bad decisions. You were a young man who inherited both the decisions and the guilt of them, which is one of the hardest positions a person can occupy. He paused. I watched you decline, James. Not the estate, you. I watched you stop engaging, stop fighting, retreat into the kind of composure that is really just a very dignified form of giving up. James was very still. What I have seen in the past 2 days, Whitmore continued, is something entirely different. I will not pretend the change is entirely your own work. It is not. But the capacity to receive this kind of change, to allow it to learn from it, to work beside someone rather than over them, that capacity is yours. He nodded once, the gesture of a man closing an argument. It is enough for me. He set down the brandy glass. I will recommend the restructure to the board, he said, with a personal letter of support. The timeline will be tight, but I believe we can move it within 6 weeks. 2 weeks faster than the deadline. Mary breathed. James leaned forward. Henry, don't thank me yet, Whitmore said. The board has final authority, and they are not sentimental men. He stood. But I have been in this business for 30 years, and I have learned that the strongest argument is always the truth. You have shown me the truth of this estate. I will show it to the board. He left the following morning. The 6 weeks that followed were the most sustained tension Mary had lived through since the early days of the marriage, which was saying something because the early days of the marriage had been considerable. The difference was that she did not live through them alone. James was at her side for every conversation with Jennings, every document review, every calculation of contingency options, in the event the bank did not move in time. He did not defer to her, and he did not override her. He worked beside her, which was the thing she had asked for and not entirely believed was possible, and which turned out to be the most steadying experience of her adult life. They sold the timber rights on the northern boundary as a contingency measure. $4,200 negotiated by Mary in a single afternoon meeting that left the timber broker looking somewhat winded. James watched the negotiation from the corner of the room with the expression of a man who is filing something permanently in memory. "That was," he began when the broker left. "Effective," Mary said, not looking up from the signed documents. "I was going to say extraordinary." She looked up. He was watching her with that unguarded expression she was still learning to receive without deflecting. "You say that word a great deal," she said. "You give me a great deal of occasion for it." She went back to the documents, but something warm had settled in her chest that stayed there through the rest of the afternoon. The board's decision arrived on a Wednesday morning 6 days before the consortium's deadline. Jennings brought it himself, which told Mary something before she even read it, because Jennings was a man who sent documents by post when the news was ordinary. He came into the front parlor with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has unexpectedly good news and is not quite certain how to deliver it without seeming dramatic. "The board approved the restructure," he said. "Full terms favorable rate the timeline Mr. Whitmore proposed." Mary sat down, not from weakness, from the simple need to be in contact with something solid, while the 6 weeks of sustained tension left her body all at once, the way a storm leaves completely and without warning. James was standing behind her. She felt rather than saw him move, and then his hand was on her shoulder, just briefly, warm and certain, the touch of a man who knows exactly when to offer contact and exactly how much. "The consortium will be paid within the week." Jennings continued settling into his professional register because that was how he managed his own feelings about good news, which he had learned to keep orderly. "The deed to Fairfield Manor remains with the family. The restructured note is 30% more favorable than the previous terms." He paused. Mr. Whitmore's letter, I am told, was decisive. He described the estate as, he consulted his notes, "the most compelling evidence of sound management and genuine recovery I have encountered in 30 years of banking, driven by a partnership that I believe represents the future of estate stewardship in this county." A partnership. Mary heard that word and felt something complete itself. Not end complete, the way a structure completes when the final piece is set and you understand for the first time the full shape of what you have been building. Jennings stayed for lunch and left in the early afternoon. Agnes fed him as if she had always intended to, which meant she had been listening from the kitchen hallway and had started cooking when she heard the word approved. When the house was quiet, Mary went to the greenhouse. She had not been in it since she returned from Charleston. There had not been time, and she had not let herself take time, because taking time felt like a luxury she could not afford until the crisis was resolved. But now it was resolved, and she went to the greenhouse, and she stood in it, with the smell of green and growing things around her, and the winter light coming through the glass, and she looked at the lilacs that had filled out over the months into something real and rooted. James found her there. She heard him come in, heard him stop a few feet behind her. "Jennings gone on?" she asked. "An hour ago." He came to stand beside her, close. "Agnes is very pleased with herself." Agnes is always very pleased with herself. Today she has more reason than usual. They stood in the warm air of the greenhouse looking at the lilacs together. "Mary." His voice was quiet. "I know," she said. "I haven't said it." "I know what you're going to say. Then let me say it anyway." He turned to face her. "I am sorry. For the secondary collateral. For not telling you. For every decision I made alone that should have been ours together in this crisis and in every one before it." His voice was steady, unhurried. "I am not asking you to accept the apology. I am asking you to believe that I understand what I did and why it was wrong, and that I intend specifically and practically not as a vague intention, but as a daily practice to be different." She turned to look at him. "James." Her voice was gentle. "I have watched you be different. For 6 weeks I have watched you be the person you just described. That is not nothing. It's not enough on its own. No, she agreed. It isn't. But it's real. And real is where I put my faith, not in promises. She held his gaze. You showed me. That matters more than the showing was comfortable for you. He was quiet for a moment. I have thought, he said slowly, a great deal about what your father said, about choosing security over happiness, about making decisions for other people because you believe you know what they can handle. His voice dropped. I have spent my entire life doing exactly that, to myself and to the people around me. And I have spent the past 2 years watching you do the opposite, watching you look directly at the hard thing and deal with it every time without flinching. He paused. You have taught me more about what it means to actually live in a life rather than manage one from a distance than any other experience I have ever had. She looked at him. We have taught each other, she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. You are not a man who asks for help, she said. You are not a man who admits limitation. You are not a man who invites the bank manager to walk the fields as evidence, rather than having the bank manager's opinion delivered at arm's length through a solicitor. She paused. You have done all of those things, not easily, but you did them. You told me to. You did them, she repeated. That is the distinction. The greenhouse was warm and still. He reached out and touched her face, just with his hand against her cheek, the gesture of a man who has been careful for a very long time and has finally given himself permission to stop being careful. She did not step back. She put her hand over his and held it there. I want to ask you something, he said. Ask. When you came home from Charleston, when you stood at the edge of the east field, and I turned around and saw you. His voice was careful. I asked myself what you were feeling, what you had decided, and I could not read it, which was unusual, because I have learned to read you fairly well. He searched her face. What were you feeling? She considered the question honestly. Relief, she said. That the field looked well, that you had held it. A pause. And something I did not have a word for at the time, which I have since identified. What was it? Home, she said. I was feeling that I was home, not to the estate, to you. She held his gaze. I am not a woman who uses that word carelessly. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I know. And he kissed her, not with the careful restraint of a man managing his feelings. Not with the performance of a man demonstrating something. With the directness of a man who has been waiting a very long time for the right moment and has recognized clearly that this is it. She kissed him back. Outside the greenhouse, Fairfield Manor went on being exactly what it was, the estate that had been failing 2 years ago, and was now genuinely running on the strength of two people who had learned to build something together rather than alongside each other. The east field was in. The accounts were orderly. The tenants were stable. Agnes was managing the kitchen with the absolute authority of a woman who has been given the respect she deserves and has no intention of relinquishing it. Edward Calloway was planning the spring drainage maintenance with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose expertise has been consistently recognized and appropriately compensated. The greenhouse held the lilacs. And inside it, two people who had begun as a transaction and had become something the transaction could never have predicted, stood with their foreheads together and their hands holding, and 2 years of careful distance finally completely gone. The winter that followed was the first one Mary had spent at Fairfield Manor without a crisis underneath it. She had not understood until its absence how much of her energy had been allocated to the sustained management of emergency. First the estate's financial collapse, then the Hargrove affair, then the seasonal crises of rebuilding, then her father's illness, then the shipping loss and the consortium deadline. She had moved from one urgency to the next with such consistency that she had not noticed the urgency had become her normal register. In its absence, she discovered what Fairfield Manor felt like when it was simply living. She discovered it in small ways. In the mornings when she came to her office not to solve an immediate problem, but to review accounts that were running correctly. In the evenings when there was time after dinner for something other than planning for reading for conversation. for the particular pleasure of sitting beside someone you love in a warm room, while the winter pressed against the windows and had no claim on anything inside. She discovered it in James too, the version of him that existed when he was not under pressure and not performing composure as a defense mechanism. Hey, was it turned out funny? Not loudly funny, not the kind of humor that fills a room, but the precise, quiet kind that catches you off guard. A word placed in exactly the right position. A dry observation delivered with complete innocence of expression. She had glimpsed it before in moments. Now she saw it in its full native habitat, and it delighted her in a way she had not been delighted since she was a girl. He discovered things about her too. He discovered that she was a ferocious reader, not of novels, which he had assumed, but of scientific and economic texts, which she consumed with the focused hunger of a person who had been told for most of her life that this appetite was inappropriate and had fed it in secret ever since. He brought her a box of books from the county bookseller one afternoon in January. Books he had selected himself based on what he had watched her read, and she stood in the front hall holding the box and said nothing for a moment that was slightly too long. "Too many?" he asked, misreading the silence. "James." She looked up. "How did you know about the Malthus essay?" "You mentioned it in August, when we were going over the tenant yield projections. You said the population argument was oversimplified, and you wanted to read the primary text rather than the summary." She had said that in passing, in the middle of a working conversation. He had not only heard it, he had remembered it specifically 4 months later and acted on it. She set the box down. She stepped forward and kissed him in the front hallway, with Agnes approximately 15 feet away in the kitchen, and she did not care at all. Agnes said nothing, though she was for the rest of that afternoon in an unusually excellent mood. Spring came to Fairfield Manor in the way it always did in Virginia. Suddenly, completely, as if winter had been a collective misunderstanding that the earth was now correcting. The east field went back in. Edward Calloway supervised the drainage maintenance with his characteristic mixture of competence and economy of language. The tenant families began the planting season with the confidence of people who have spent 2 years learning that the estate they work for pays on time and listens when they speak. In April, Richard Pembroke came to visit. Not on business or not primarily. He came to see his daughter, which was something he had always done, but had rarely named as the purpose, preferring to arrive with a business reason and allow the personal to proceed alongside it. This time he arrived with no business reason and said so plainly in his letter, which was so unlike him that Mary had read the letter twice and then smiled. He arrived looking well, better than well actually, with the particular vitality of a man who has been frightened by his own mortality and has made significant adjustments in response. He walked the estate with James on the first morning. Mary watched them from the office window, the two of them moving along the south pasture boundary. Richard's head tilted in the way it always was when he was listening carefully to something. She did not know what they talked about. She found out at dinner. "I owe you an apology," Richard said, looking at his daughter across the table, in the direct way of a man who has rehearsed this and decided to deliver it without softening. "Not for the match itself. I still believe Fairfield is a good man, and what I have seen today confirms it." He paused. "For not asking you. For deciding what was best for you without consulting the person whose life it was. I was practical where I should have been." He seemed to search for the word. "Honest," Mary said. "Honest," Richard agreed. "Yes." A silence. "I am not unhappy, Papa," Mary said. "I want you to know that clearly." Richard looked at her, then at James, then back at Mary. "No," he said. "I can see that you are not." There was something in his voice that she recognized, the sound of a man who has been carrying a guilt and has just been unexpectedly released from it. He raised his glass. He did not make a speech. That was not Richard Pembroke's way. He simply raised his glass toward his daughter and then toward his son-in-law and drank. James raised his in return. Mary looked at her father, who had sold her to save a stranger's fortune, and who had written her authority into a contract, and who had said to her husband, "Recognize what you have in her." She raised her glass. The evening went on. Agnes outdid herself, which was her consistent response to visitors she considered worth the effort. The fire burned low. The conversation moved through business and memory, and small family stories that Richard Pembroke had never told in mixed company, and that Mary had never heard, which meant he was either performing a kind of deliberate openness, or that the cardiac episode had, as such, events sometimes do rearranged his priorities in ways that were still resolving. She thought it was probably both. Later, after Richard had gone to his room, and Agnes had cleared, and the house had gone quiet, Mary and James sat in the small sitting room in the particular comfortable silence they had developed over the winter, a silence that did not need to be filled, that was itself a kind of conversation. "He's different," James said. "He is." She looked at the fire. "Frightening yourself has a way of clarifying things." "Does it?" She glanced at him. "Are you speaking generally or asking me something specific?" "Something specific." He turned to look at her. "When the letter arrived, the Whitmore letter, and you understood what we were facing, what I had put us in the way of again, without telling you." He paused. "You said you weren't afraid." "I wasn't. I want to understand that." His voice was genuine. "I was terrified, not of losing the estate, though I was that too, but of losing you, of having done the thing again that would make you look at me and see the man you married rather than the man you chose." She looked at him. "Those are the same man," she said. "Mary, James." Her voice was quiet but certain. "The man I married was capable of becoming the man I chose. I did not know that when I married him, but it was always true." She held his gaze. "I was not afraid when the letter arrived because I had already decided to be here. And being here means being here for the hard things as well as the right ones." A pause. "That is what choosing someone actually means. Not choosing the version of them that has no flaws. Choosing the whole person and deciding that the whole person is worth it." I was very still. "Are you?" he asked. "Worth it?" She looked at him. She thought about the East Field, and the lilacs, and the letter in the rain, and the greenhouse in November, and 6 weeks of crisis, and a box of books in January, and a man who remembered an offhand comment about a Malthus essay 4 months after she made it. "Yes," she said. "I think we both are." The fire settled. The room was warm. The manor was quiet around them in the way a house is quiet when everything inside it is at rest. Not empty, not held. Breath, but genuinely at peace with itself. James reached across and took her hand. She let him. She turned her hand over and held his properly. The grip of equals, of people who have worked alongside each other through something real and have come out the other side, still standing, still here, still choosing. This was not the marriage that had been written in a contract in the spring of 1816. This was something that had been built piece by piece, argument by argument, crisis by crisis. November, greenhouse and Charleston kitchen, and rainy East Field and breakfast table, and 8 weeks of sustained pressure that had not broken them, but had shown them definitively what they were made of. This was a marriage that two people had chosen, and choice. Mary Fairfield had always known from her father's ledgers to her own, was the only currency that never lost its value. The lilacs bloomed in May. They filled the greenhouse with the smell that had come through an open door on a Wednesday morning 2 years ago, and stopped her in her tracks, and James came to stand beside her in the doorway, the way he had learned to come and stand beside her, not announcing himself, not asking if he was wanted, simply arriving and being present in the way of someone who has earned the right to simply arrive. She did not look at him. She did not need to. "They bloomed," she said. "They did." His shoulder was warm against hers. She breathed in the smell of them, green and alive and wild, with something that had not yet been named, but had always been reaching toward the light. Mary Pembroke Fairfield had come to this estate as a transaction. She had turned it into a home. She had turned the man who bought her into the man who chose her, and she had built out of debt and crisis and imperfect love and 2 years of work that never stopped a life that was fully, completely, irreversibly her own. That was not a small thing. That was everything. End.